Hello and welcome to EST Podcast. This is Hafsa, the Deputy Head of the Observatory on EU-MENA Relations, and you are listening to EST Podcast, where we invite leading experts to engage in hot topics related to Europe and international politics. And today, we are talking about the food crisis in Tunisia. Over the past months, Tunisia has been recording skyrocketing inflation rates and overwhelming public debt. As a result, food rationing has become an everyday problem for many Tunisians, and the future of government subsidies is in limbo. And combined with the ongoing political crisis and President Kais Said's very low popularity, the situation is nothing but complex. So, in order to understand the intricacies of the food crisis in Tunisia, we are joined by Dr. Eya Jrad. Dr. Eya holds a PhD in International Relations Law from the University of Carthage. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who specializes in institutional governance and reform, social and state resilience, radicalization, and the prevention and countering of violent extremism. Interestingly, my guest has practical experience working in many countries in the MENA region, including Tunisia. Dr. Eya, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, without further ado, can you please provide an overview of this situation in Tunisia?
Of course, thank you. You started by mentioning actually an overall image and picture of the actual situation in Tunisia. And it has been really not looking good for the last few months, but also years. You've mentioned the inflation rate. It has exceeded a record of 10%, I think 10.1% in the month of December. The trade deficit has increased nearly doubled in the last 2 years. And as you've mentioned, just a month before the holy month of Ramadan, during which usually demand increases, there are considerable and very important food shortages. Most of the products, if found, are sold in very limited quantities. And this touches essential goods such as milks, oil, sugar, coffee, butter, and even medication and mineral water. So this is the overall situation. And beyond the fact that it had shaken the consumer purchasing power, it had also created these apocalyptic images where sceneries of citizens queuing or sometimes fighting over a packet of sugar, or drivers attacking the employees at gas stations and disrupting traffic. So it's really getting really bad in the last few months.
Right. And what about civil society? How is it reacting to that problem?
There have been few initiatives to try, especially to raise awareness on the side of consumers on how to change their diets, what are the best practices in terms of traditional Tunisian cuisine and what actually we used to eat in the past 20 years. But there are also very inspiring initiatives working with local farmers, with women local farmers, in order to support them, diversify their products in order for them to be able to counter the impacts of climate change, but also to be able, especially for women, to provide for that family food security and to transfer the knowledge beyond the family into the neighborhood and maybe into the neighborhood as a whole.
Yeah, and many factors seem to explain Tunisia's food crisis. Some talk about the domestic political crisis, COVID, drought, the war in Ukraine, among others, of course. But it is somehow, difficult to determine which ones are significant or, which ones explain the problem and which ones exacerbate it. So can you please enlighten us on that?
Yes, thank you, Hafsa. It's actually, since it's a multidimensional crisis, it has been caused by multiple factors. It's important to differentiate the international factors and the national linked factors. So, of course, the Ukrainian invasion, the shortage and increases in global prices for certain products, energy and wheat, basically has impacted Tunisia imports of large parts of its need. Climate crisis and climate change had also impacted the land, the quality of the land, but also the quality of the water, their availability and their ratification. This all has contributed to the crisis. But at the national level, it's also important to distinguish between the factors that reside at the governmental level, the factors that reside at the sectoral level, and the factor that reside at the consumer level. So at the governmental level or at the state level, it's important to highlight the precariousness of public finance. You have mentioned, Hafsa, how public finances in Tunisia are facing a crisis. The state is unable to fulfill its commitment to public companies. These are in charge of purchasing important goods. So, example, the oil office, the trade office, the wheat office, etc. These offices has been consequently unable to pay their creditors, either private sector operators or foreign suppliers, and have lost all credibility vis-à-vis those suppliers. This has made these suppliers make payment a precondition for all import operation. This increased, again, the pressure on public finances. There is also the depreciation of the Tunisian dinar against the foreign currency, especially the US dollar, and the weakness of national production in different sectors. At the sectoral level, it's important to understand that this crisis did not result from today or yesterday or the Ukrainian crisis. The Ukrainian crisis has exacerbated it, but it has been there. It has been there for years now for the milk sector, for instance. Now that the country is facing a milk crisis, the milk sector has been facing problems for years now due to the rise of world prices of animal feed that are imported, of course. So these increases in the prices had impacted the cows and the herds in Tunisia. The selling prices in Tunisia, because of milk is subsidized, cost of production is much higher than the cost of selling, which made farmers lose for years. They are working at loss. So many of the farmers have sold their cows and they just shifted careers, as simple as that. I think the Ministry of Agriculture estimates the decrease in herd for the last few years at 30%. This tells us how the sector has been impacted. The crisis also has been there for years, since the early 90s, when the government decided to encourage farmers to adopt foreign hybrid seeds. These seeds have been distributed free of charge to Tunisian farmers instead of using the local authentic Tunisian seeds. The imported seeds have proven to be unsuited for the Tunisian climate, less resistant to the impact of climate change, but most importantly, they are more costly in water consumption and chemical treatment requirements. So all these factors have impacted what the agriculture system is facing today. Add to it, of course, poor governance, poor infrastructure, and poor storage conditions, especially for wheat. There are many other factors that both the sectoral level and the government level interact and interlink. For instance, the failure to stock a strategic stock of food products, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, the third level, which is very important, is also the consumer level or the consumer factors. There is a climate of panic in Tunisia that has gripped consumers. They are now buying and carrying out panic buying. Tunisians are seeking to build stocks at home which aggravated the shortages of these products and exacerbates the crisis. Also, the change in the diet of Tunisians in the past few years had also impacted the situation. Far from the traditional Tunisian diet, the Tunisian diet today is high in calories, with high level of sugar, salt and fat, and high consumption of meat and dairy products. I think Tunisia today is the biggest consumer of bread and the second biggest consumer of pasta after the Italians in the world. So all these factors all together, both at the state level, at the bottom level with the citizen and at the sectoral level, they all have contributed to the worsening of the situation we are witnessing today in 2023 and probably in the future years if nothing is done to improve the situation and to reform the situation.
And can you tell us about what the government is doing to tackle this crisis? It is clearly very complex, very difficult. So, what is the government doing to tackle that?
It's very problematic because it has been between adaptation but also resistance. The official discourse is about reassuring the citizens that there is no actual food shortages, and President Qais Said official discourse is that shortages of certain products is not motivated by scarcity of production or unavailability of these products, but it's the result of practices of the monopolist. Monopoly has became this the only factor contributing to the food crisis, which is not entirely untrue, but it's not the only factor as they contributed to be. The government is trying at the moment to reinitiate the negotiation with the IMF for the loan of about, I think, $2 billion in order to try to face this economic and financial crisis the country is going towards.
Thank you very much. And I've recently read that the authorities, they regularly inspect warehouses and they seize illegally stored products to prevent, quote unquote, the explosion of black market activity. So my question is, how is the food crisis exacerbating black market activity? And what layer of complexity does that add to the overall food crisis in Tunisia?
It's important to highlight that at this level, even some foods are not available at the black market. That's how big and grave the crisis is. But of course, the black market had hampered access to especially subsidized products and subsidized goods. If we look at subsidized oil, I think it cost around 11 Tunisian dinar to buy it, for a simple consumer to buy it. But it's sold to restaurants, to hotels, and to pastries and pastry chef who buy a bottle for 30 dinars. And this large portion goes for the domination of middlemen. They are controlling a big part of the black market, but the crisis has gone so bad that even in the black market, it's very difficult to find these products today. It has contributed. It's one of the factors. It's not the only factor as the official discourse presented. And today it's not as big as many other problems we have mentioned earlier.
Right. I'll move to a different aspect of the crisis. And so the EU is doing a lot to boost economic recovery in Tunisia. And, many of its projects are part of the so-called European neighborhood policy. So, we're talking about donations, loans, emergency support packages, and projects like the FARB initiative. So, for example, the EU, through its European Investment Bank, approved a massive loan to boost the supply of food. And my question is, according to you, to what extent are these projects effective?
I think it's rather than injecting money in Tunisia's economy without actual follow-up and monitoring mechanism, it's important for the EU or other friends of Tunisia to start supporting real reforms that come out from real needs, not as prescribed by the IMF, for instance. It's important to think of alternative ways towards this, a new social contract, a new reform in the country that it's not induced by injecting foreign currency, but it's real reformed that reduces inequality, that takes advantage of what Tunisia has to offer in order for it to cover its food crisis, its food needs, and eventually its food sovereignty.
Yeah, and when we look at Tunisia's over-reliance on imports and, attempts to secure an IMF loan, that invites us to ask the following question, to what extent is Tunisia sovereign when it comes to making economic or financial decisions?
It's very difficult to be sovereign when debts and repayments have swallowed the country into a vicious circle. It has been the case after 2011. The country was swallowed in debts to repay the debts before the uprisings. And from 2011, new debts and new repayments have just gone to the roof. So external debt portfolio is mostly characterized by the dominance of the euro and other currencies, but especially the euro, marking the importance of Tunisia's economic dependency to EU countries. And this dependence leaves very little room to maneuver for Tunisia in any scenario, especially when it comes to negotiation, for instance, the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. It's difficult to have a sovereign standing when you are so much in debt towards the European communities or other creditors. So it's just impossible to be sovereign, even though the president of the country always mentions sovereignty. It's a very difficult situation to convince creditors that you are sovereign when you're unable to bet your principal or interest loans.
Yeah, and always on that aspect, if we talk about a lot of loans, it's not healthy for any economy. And of course, the Tunisian economy is no exception to that. So what is the cost for Tunisia and for the Tunisian people?
If we look at Tunisia's external debt service payment, both principal and interest, I think it's consuming more than the quarter of Tunisian public revenues. So more than 25% of revenues go to creditors, while the Tunisian government is bound by no raises in wages, no new recruitments in public services. It's just so constraining to both the state and the people. It's just not appropriate for Tunisian to accept that they shall pay higher prices for food and higher prices for energy, while at the same time such a big chunk of the public revenues go to creditor. So it's just, again, this vicious circle of debt and people being unable to accept the situation because they are directly impacted by the situation as a whole.
Dr. Eya, you have extensive experience in consulting and advising many organizations. So what would be or what should be done to tackle the roots of food insecurity, at the domestic and foreign levels?
There have been many proposals to start resolving the current crisis. A few days ago, the president decreed the extension of the state of emergency. I think at this stage, a state of a food emergency should be declared and really emergent decisions should be taken. For instance, I think at this stage, it's not appropriate for a state to exert some economic activities like importing wheat and importing sugar and coffee. It should withdraw from these economic activities and maybe control, supervise the sector, but not be the only interlocutor for the import of these operations. For the agriculture sector, there is a huge reform to be done. As I said, the state of emergency should be declared immediately. The infrastructure should be looked at. I have priorly mentioned the feed situation or the seed situation with the import of foreign hybrid seed. The National Gene Bank, the Tunisian National Seed Gene Bank, is retrieving and trying to get back the Tunisian seed that are everywhere in the world. So getting back those authentic seeds that are really suitable to the Tunisian climate, they're less consuming of water, less consuming of chemical treatment, and start working with these seeds and cultivating those seeds. Also, the choice of cultivated products must necessarily take into account its water consumption. For instance, the country should review its strategy, avoid or limit water-consuming cultivations such as tomatoes, watermelon, and citrus fruits. These are very, at the current moment of water scarcity, these are very and highly consuming of water and should be revised. It's necessary to limit the import of certain products and boost local production. But the money or the resources that are allocated to importing certain products should be allocated to supporting local farmers into producing the Tunisian cultivation and Tunisian wheats and cereal, etc. Many other proposals could be done, but especially with regard to the agriculture sector, improving the infrastructure, supporting the local farmers and very small farmers that have been impacted throughout the years by the liberal model of development of Tunisia, helping those improve their capacities, both technical and resources, mobilizing resources in order for them to be able to counter the climate change and to counter the resource scarcity and to counter the crisis they are currently going through.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Eya, for the expert recommendations. And I'd like to go back a little bit to the EU and, EU projects or initiatives to support Tunisia. And I was wondering if there are countries like France, for example. I was wondering what they're doing, like at the country level, to help Tunisia. I've read that France is, of course, it is very interested in the political situation in Tunisia. And I was wondering, I'd like to know what's your take on that.
France and many other European countries have been bilaterally collaborating with Tunisia on both the agriculture sector and other sectors. But I think the help so far has been really it didn't go really deep into reforming the sector, and it really, to be able to implement it, it needs the political will and the openness of the Tunisian government as well. So it's not up to the European countries to define where the country is going, but it really needs political will from the Tunisian government and openness to accept what is needed at this stage to support the Tunisian agriculture. But I think Germany as well is doing supporting the agriculture sector at the very local level through capacity building programs, through sometimes improvement of the tools, etc. But these are very very punctual and very short-term support, and it needs to be let's say more courageous, and it really depends on the political will and the clear vision from the Tunisian state to be able to planify a reform and implement it on the ground.
And so if I understood you correctly, so the absence or the very low or limited political openness or will. How do you explain it? Is it just a lack of vision, as you briefly mentioned, or is it some very deep causes?
The problem here is the development model that Tunisia has for years. It has given the advantage to the big farms and the big agriculture farmers at the expenses of very small farmers. So they have introduced, or the country has introduced advantages to the international market for big farmers while really impoverishing the small farmers. So it's the whole approach to the agriculture sector that has been problematic since the 80s till today, and we are paying the price today. It's the political vision, but also the actual approach and technicity that the country has looked at the agriculture sector through.
Thank you very much. And my final question for you is about the prospects for Tunisia. We see that the situation is indeed very complex, but we know that Tunisia has a civil society that celebrates progress. And we're also talking about a country where education has long been a priority and where the 2011 uprisings did not leave scars like armed conflict or foreign armed intervention. So, is it naive to think that Tunisia will overcome the current crisis without major costs?
I wouldn't say naive, but it's important to take into account that civil society has been fighting for years and we are now witnessing fatigue. And they are tired. The civil society sector is tired. Education has contributed to developing the local knowledge, but also we are facing huge waves of both regular and irregular migration at the moment. It's important to be aware that if the situation continues the way it is, it's not, the prospects are not that bright. Unless a real decision is taken and a real planning was created, the prospects are not very, very, very bright and very clear. With the absence of financing today to meet the large funding needs the country needs, it just raises the default risk. And with the purchasing power dropping, there is a serious threat that would lead to social disruption. So the way it is now, I wouldn't say it would lead into major disruption and armed conflict, but still it will lead to certain disruption and to a certain dissatisfaction of the population, creating a certain political and social crisis. And again, if the situation worsens and people are with the impoverishment of the middle class and famine, if we are bound to accept aid from other countries, the price to pay would be extremely high. It would be a total loss of the country's sovereignty. So until being really aware of the origins of the current crisis and being aware of the needs for a structural and deep reform and really courageous medium and long-term decisions, the prospects are not really very bright, let's say.
All right, dear listeners, I hope you enjoyed that episode with expert Eya Jrad, who enlightened us on the intricacies of the food crisis in Tunisia and gave expert recommendations on how to mitigate it, but also reflected on the prospects of the current crisis. As we learned, the landscape is indeed very complicated, but that does not mean in any way that the Tunisian people won't be able to start a new chapter. Eventually, Tunisia gave us a lesson in hope and resilience in 2011, and a country that had once been labeled as an anomaly by well-respected scholar Safwan Masri will certainly find its way through this crisis. You can learn more about my guest's work on Twitter and LinkedIn at Eya Jrad. Thank you very much, Dr. Eya, and a big thanks to the incredible EST audience for its abundant support. Stay safe, everyone.